Stand straighter than that, or Mr. Verrell will have you back on the road by supper." The voice came from behind him, low and unhurried, and Rodri Castellet, who had commanded a wing of cavalry at Salamanca and had not been corrected by anyone in 11 years, found that his spine obeyed it before his pride could object. He was standing in the passage outside the servants' hall of Dunmow Court, in a borrowed livery coat one size too narrow across the shoulders, holding a silver salver he had been given 3 minutes ago, and had already tilted badly enough to send a folded newspaper sliding off the edge. "Tum under the rim," the voice said. "Not on it. You'll leave marks on the plate, and then you'll be made to clean it, and then you'll be made to clean it again, because the first time will be wrong." He turned his head. A housemaid stood in the doorway with a coal scuttle balanced against her hip as though it weighed nothing, though he could see by the set of her wrist that it weighed a great deal. Grey wool, white apron, coarse linen, mended at the hem in stitches so small they were nearly invisible. A cap over dark hair, and under the cap a face that was not beautiful in the way the drawing rooms of London reckoned beauty, too watchful, the mouth too serious, and that he found he was still looking at some seconds after he ought to have stopped. "Thumb under the rim," he repeated. "Say it as if you mean to remember it." She shifted the scuttle. "What's your name?" "Ash," he said. "Tom Ash." It was the name of a gamekeeper who had died when Rodri was 9, and it came out of him easily, which he did not entirely like. "Well, Tom Ash." She looked at the salver, and then at the coat, and then briefly at his hands, which were not the hands of a footman, and both of them knew it. She said nothing about that. "You've the look of a man who's never carried anything he didn't want to carry. That'll change by Thursday." Then she was gone down the passage toward the boot room, and Rodri stood in the half-dark under the bell-board with the newspaper at his feet, and understood that he had just been the least important person in a conversation for the first time in his adult life. He had come home 3 days before at night, on a hired horse, having sent no word ahead. The letters had begun in March, a tenant's daughter writing in a laborious hand to a duke she had never seen, because there was no one else left to write to. The relief fund had been closed, she said. The winter money that Dunmow had paid out to its people since his grandfather's day, the coal and the flour and the small hard coins that carried a family from January to April, had simply stopped coming, and when the tenants asked, they were told the Duke had ordered it stopped, which was a lie. Rodri had ordered nothing. Rodri, God forgive him, had ordered nothing at all in 4 years, had been in Vienna, in Naples, in any house that was not this one, because this one held the room where his father died, calling him useless, and the chapel where his brother was buried. And a man may run a very long way on such fuel before it burns out. So he had come back, and on the road, at an inn 2 hours south, he had sat listening to a carter explain to the innkeeper that Dunmow plate was turning up in Bristol, and that the Duke was a fool, and that the Duke's steward was a very clever man indeed, and Rodri, who had been about to announce himself at his own gates with all the noise a duke can make, had thought better of it. Announce himself, and every ledger in the house would be corrected by morning. Every guilty man would be warned by the shine of his boots. He had gone instead to the back gate at first light, in a coat he had bought off a tinker, and told the housekeeper that he had heard there was a place going for a footman. Mrs. Ivory Fawkes had looked at him for a long, dry moment, a small woman, iron-haired, keys at her waist, who had known him when he was a boy in a nankeen jacket, and had certainly known him now. He had watched the recognition arrive in her eyes and settle there and be locked away like the linen. She had said, "You'll want a character reference." "I have none." "No," she had agreed. "You have not." And then, after a silence that lasted about as long as a decision, "We are short a man. You will sleep in the attic with Ned Pike, and you will do as you are told. By everyone. Do you understand me, Ash? By everyone," he had said. "Then we shall see what you are made of," said Mrs. Fawkes, "which is more than this house has known in some while," and gave him a livery coat that had belonged to a man 3 inches narrower, and did not speak of it again. That was Monday. By Wednesday he had blacked 11 pairs of boots badly, dropped a decanter stopper, been sworn at by the cook, been laughed at by 2 grooms and a laundry maid, and learned that a duke may be tall and rich and cleverer than most men in a room, and still be entirely useless before 10 o'clock in the morning if he cannot lay a fire. And he had learned the name of the maid with the coal scuttle. It was Marge Ivy. She was 23. She had been at Dunmow since she was 15, and she was the only person in the house who had not yet found him amusing. The servants' hall took its dinner at 12:30. At a long deal table scrubbed so often it had gone the colour of old bone, and rank ran down its length as strictly as it ran down the great table upstairs. Mistress Cobb the butler at the head, Mrs. Fawkes at the foot, the valet and the ladies' maids and the under-butler in the good middle, and then, dwindling away toward the door and the draught, the footman and the hall boy and the scullery, and at the very end, in the coldest chair, the new man who could not carry a salver. The joint came down the table from the head. By the time it reached Rhodri there was gristle and a heel of fat and nothing else, and he took it without comment, because he had eaten worse in Spain. A hand came past his shoulder and set down a plate, bread, 2 thick slices with butter, and a wedge of cheese, and it was not the cheese they had put out on the board. "Eat it before Mr. Cobb turns round," Marge said very quietly, already moving. "You can't do a day's work on a bone." He looked up. She had gone by, was pouring small beer at the middle of the table with her face perfectly composed, and did not look back at him, and something in his chest turned over so completely that he had to set both hands flat on the table. Nobody had fed him in 20 years. People had served him. There was a difference, and he had never known it before, and he learned it in a servant's hall with a plate of bread in front of him at the cold end of a table. That night he sat on the edge of a straw mattress in the attic while Ned Pike snored, and he did what he had come to do. He thought about the theft. It was not small. The relief fund alone was 200 a year, and the coal accounts had doubled while the coal in the cellars had halved. And there was plate missing. He had counted it himself, in the dark, on his second night, with a candle stub and his grandmother's inventory, which he had found where it had always been, in the 4th drawer of the muniment press. Because whoever was robbing Dunmow had not thought to look for an inventory nobody had opened since 1806, 4 salvers, a pair of candelabra, a christening cup that had been in his family since Queen Anne. And the man who held every key that mattered, who wrote every figure in every ledger, who told the tenants the Duke had ordered the money stopped, was Josiah Verrell, steward of Dunmow these 9 years, who had wept, Rhodri remembered this, wept at his father's graveside. It would have been simple to hate him, but a footman sees things, because nobody troubles to stop talking when a footman comes into a room, and what Rhodri saw in Verrell's face when the man thought himself alone was not greed, it was fear. The particular grey fear of a man who has got hold of something by the wrong end and cannot now let go of it. He wanted, badly, to tell someone. There was no one, that was the price of the coat. He blacked boots. He did it in the boot room at 6 in the morning, with a brush in each hand and the blacking jar between his knees, and he did it wrong for 3 days running, too much blacking, not enough spit, no polish at all, a smear like a bruise on the toe of Mr. Cobb's Sunday shoe. Until on the 4th morning the door opened and Marge came in with an armful of great cloths, and stopped and looked to what he was doing to a perfectly innocent boot. "Give it here. A man must learn by failing," Rhodri said. "So he is told." "You've been told that by men who never had to hand the boot back." She took it from him. She sat down on the low stool opposite, arranged the boot on her knee with the absolute economy of somebody who had done a thing 10,000 times, and said, "Watch. Blacking on, thin, Tom. You're not painting a barn. Then let it dry while you do the other, then the brush, and the brush isn't for pushing, it's for lifting, and then the cloth, and then breathe on it like this." She breathed on the leather. She polished. The boot came up like a black pool with a window in it. Rhodri watched her hands. They were red at the knuckles, and there was a burn on the back of one, healing, and a thin white scar across the base of her thumb. And it came to him with an unfamiliar and rather appalling clarity that those were the hands which kept this house standing, and that he had never once thought about them, and that he owned the house. "Why are you helping me?" he said. Marge did not look up. "Because they'll turn you out if you don't learn, and you've nowhere to go. That's plain enough on you." She set the boot down. "And because when I came here I was 15 and I couldn't fold a sheet, and Sarah Kettle showed me how, 3 nights running, when she might have laughed instead. So, A small shrug. It goes on. That's all it is. It goes on, or it stops with you. And if it stops with me? She looked up then. Her eyes were grey and level and entirely without pity, which was somehow the kindest thing about them. Then you'd be like most people, she said, and I'd think less of you. Do the other boot. He did the other boot. She watched, corrected the angle of his wrist with 2 fingers laid briefly against his sleeve, briefly, and he felt it for an hour afterward, like a coal held too long, and when the second boot came up, she said, "There. Now you're worth your bread," and gathered her cloths and went, and Rodri Castellet sat alone in the boot room in the smell of blacking and leather, paid a compliment in his own house for the first time in his life, and could not remember ever being so pleased with himself. That was the beginning of it, though he did not admit it for a fortnight. A fortnight in a great house below stairs is a long education. He learned the bells, the brass row above the passage, each with its little nameplate, the wire jerking and the tongue chattering and the whole house able to be summoned from any room by a hand that never once thought about the legs it was moving. He learned to run when the library bell went. He learned that the second footman, Ned Pike, had a sister in the poorhouse at Ludcombe and sent her half his wages. He learned that the cook, Mrs. Doggett, had a hard voice and soft hands and left a bowl of dripping toast on the range for whoever came in cold. He learned the name of the hall boy, which was Tib, and that Tib was afraid of the dark and slept with a candle stub he was not allowed to have, and that Marge Davy passed him a fresh one every Sunday and said nothing. He learned, above all, that he had never known these people. They had been standing behind his chair his whole life, and he had not known one of their names. And he learned Marge, she was not soft. That was the first surprise. She had a tongue on her when she chose, and she used it on him more than once. When he left a door standing open and let the passage go cold and he sulked. He had sulked. He was appalled to discover it, over being sent back to relay a fire. But her sharpness never went where a person could not defend it, and she was, he came to see, the still point that the whole below-stairs world turned upon without noticing. The laundry maid wept over a scorched shirt, and Marge took the blame and the scolding and never mentioned it again. Tib was cuffed by the under-butler, and Marge stepped between them so smoothly it looked like an accident of traffic. Ned Pike's sister was written to on Marge's Sunday hour, in Marge's careful hand, because Ned could not write. The house ate her hour by hour, and she went on giving it more. Why? He asked her once, in the scullery passage, with his arms full of coal and his face black to the eyebrows and no right at all to ask her anything. You could go to another place, a better one. Any house in the county would take you. Marge went on scouring, and who'd have Tib then? That is not an answer. It's the only one I've got. She looked up, and there was a smudge of ash along her jaw, and he wanted, with a violence that shocked him, to wipe it away with his thumb. People are not luggage, Tom. You can't set them down when they get heavy. He said nothing. He had set down an entire county when it got heavy. He had set down his father's grave and his brother's name and 200 souls in cottages he had never entered, and gone to Naples and drunk good wine in the sun. You look, Marge said more gently, like a man who has just been hit. Someone hit me, said Rodri, some years ago. It has only just arrived. She laughed. It was the first time. It was not a decorous drawing-room laugh. It came out of her whole, brief and low and startled, and she pressed the back of her wrist to her mouth as if to catch it, and the sound went through him like a bell rung in an empty room. He walked out into the yard afterward and stood in the rain a while. 3 days later, Mr. Cobb missed a salver. It happened in the plate room, before the whole staff, and it happened fast. The butler counting again, the butler's face going the colour of tallow, and then his hand shooting out and closing on the collar of Rodri's coat. 4 salvers gone, and one, Mr. Cobb was quite certain, had been on that shelf a week ago, before the new man came. He has no character, said the under-butler with great satisfaction. He came off the road with nothing but a coat. Mrs. Fawkes said so herself. Turn out his box, said someone. They turned out his box. There was nothing in it but a shirt, a razor, and a small worn book of Horace, which the under-butler held up as though it were a confession, and perhaps it was. A footman with Latin, he said. There's your thief. And Rodri stood in the middle of the plate room in his too narrow coat and understood, with a clarity as cold as the flagstones, that he could end this in one sentence. 4 words. Look at my face. Any of them who had been in the house 10 years would go white. He could have Varel in irons by nightfall, and Cobb on his knees, and every man in that room would remember for the rest of his life the day the Duke came up out of the servants' hall, like something out of a story. And Marged Ivey would learn, in that same moment and in that same room, that she had been feeding bread to a lie for a month. He didn't take it. Her voice, clear from the doorway and not loud. Everyone turned. She came in with her hands folded in front of her apron, and she looked at Mr. Corby and not at Rhodri at all, and she said, "Tom Ash has not been in the plate room without me or Mr. Pike standing by him, not once, not since he came. He doesn't know the shelves. He couldn't tell you where the christening cup stood if you offered him a year's wages, and it stood there, a small nod, and it's been gone since before Candlemas, and he came in June. Count that on your fingers, Mr. Cobb, and then tell me it's the new man." The silence in the plate room was terrible. "You are very free with your certainties, Ivey," said the under-butler. "I am very free with my dates," said Marged, "and you may take them to Mrs. Fawkes, who keeps the book, and see if she does not say the same." Mrs. Fawkes said the same. Mrs. Fawkes said it in 6 words and closed the plate room and sent them all back to work, and her eyes, passing over Rhodri, were as flat and hard as 2 shillings, and he read in them the plain warning that he was costing this house, and had better be worth it. That night he found Marged in the still room, alone, jarring last year's crab apples by the light of one tallow candle, and he stood in the door with his heart going like a drum and said, "You defended me. I told the truth. You did not know it was the truth." He came in. He had no business coming in. "You could not know. You have known me a month. For all you knew, Tom." She set down the jar. "I have watched you give your dinner to Tib twice. I have watched you take Ned's turn at the water when your hands were split open, and I have watched you say nothing about it after, which is the part that counts. I do not need a character reference from a stranger in another county. I have seen you." "You have seen a month of me," Rhodri said, and his voice came out wrong, and he could not fix it. "A month is a long time," said Marged Ivey, "when a person is tired. Nobody keeps up a pretense when they're tired. It's the last hour of the day that tells you who a man is." She smiled a little tiredly and wiped her hands on her apron. "And in the last hour of the day, you are kind, and you are angry about the wrong things, and you cannot lay a fire. That's who you are." He looked at her across the still room in the light of one candle, with the smell of apples and cloves between them, and knew, plainly, finally, as a man knows the ground under his boots, that he meant to marry her, and that she did not know his name. It was the worst moment of his life to that point, and it was also the happiest, and he understood at last why poets are so often confused. He went to work on Varel. He did it as a footman does it, by being furniture. He carried coals to the steward's room and took a long time about the fire. He stood at doors. He waited at the little table where Varel dined alone and drank more than a careful man ought, and he watched the man's hands and he listened, and the thing came apart in the end, not because Rhodri was clever, but because a frightened man cannot stop talking. Josiah Varel had a son. The son had gone to Bristol into the shipping trade, and the shipping trade had gone into the sea, and there had been notes of hand, and the notes had been bought up by a man in Bristol named Coldray, who was very patient and not at all kind. Varel had paid him with the coal money, then with the plate. Then, when Coldray's patience thinned, with the relief fund, telling the tenants the Duke had ordered it stopped, because the Duke was in Naples and the Duke would never know, and the Duke in 9 years had answered exactly 2 of his steward's letters. Rhodri found the whole of it in an hour, on a Tuesday night, in a locked desk he opened with a bent wire Ned Pike had taught him to use for a stuck window. Receipts, pawn tickets from a Bristol silversmith, a letter from Coldray of such smooth and civil menace that it turned the stomach. And at the bottom of the drawer, a bundle of Varel's own letters to the Duke of Dunmow, sent and returned unopened and kept, 9 of them. The last was dated 4 years ago, and it began, "Your Grace, I am in a difficulty which I am ashamed to lay before you, but I have no other friend." Rhodri sat down on the floor of the steward's room with the letters in his hands and the candle guttering and the whole long, sick, absolute weight it coming down on him at once. The man had stolen. That was true, and would remain true. But he had come to his master first, 9 times, and his master had been in Naples, and had not opened the letters, because opening letters from Dunmow meant thinking about Dunmow. There is a kind of theft, he thought, that a man commits with a locked drawer. And there is another that a man commits with a closed door, and it takes 9 years, and it takes a whole estate, and nobody ever calls it theft at all, because the man who does it is a duke. He put the letters in his shirt. He sat in the dark a while longer. Then he went out to the yard and stood under the pump in the cold, and made his decision, the first decision he had ever made. He would think afterward. That was not chiefly about his own comfort. He would end it, all of it. He would take back his name and his house and settle Verrall and settle Coldray and open the relief fund and stand in his own hall as what he was. And then he would go to Marge Divey and tell her the truth, and she would look at him the way she had looked at him in the still room, and that was the part he could not think about, because when he tried his hands went cold. He had perhaps 3 days. It took 2. What undid him was that he was too slow by a single morning. The man Coldray came to Dunmow on a Thursday, in a good coat, with 2 men behind him who were not gentlemen, and he came not to the front door but to the steward's office by the yard, and he came to be paid. And Verrall had nothing left to pay him with but a christening cup and his own ruin, and the shouting carried across the stable yard, and half the household came out of the doors to hear it. Rhodri was in the boot room. He came out with a blacking brush still in his hand. He was aware, afterward, of very few of the details. He was aware of Verrall's face, grey as ash, and of Coldray saying something about the magistrate and the assizes in the pleasant voice of a man who has already won, and of Mrs. Fawkes on the step with her keys in her fist, and of Marged in the doorway of the kitchen passage with a bowl of peas in her hands, watching perfectly still. And he was aware that if he waited 1 minute longer, Josiah Verrall would be taken up in that yard, before the whole staff, for a theft that had begun with 9 unopened letters. So he put down the brush. "That is enough," said the Duke of Dunmow. It was not loud. It did not have to be. Rhodri had not used that voice in 4 years, and he was mildly astonished to find it still worked. The yard went silent the way a room goes silent when a glass breaks. He walked out across the cobbles in a footman's livery with blacking to the wrist, and he did not hurry, and he stopped in front of Coldray, and he looked at him for a long moment out of the face of a man whose grandfather had built the wall Coldray was standing against. "You will state your business to me," he said, "and you will do it civilly, and then you will leave my land." Coldray laughed. Coldray said something about footmen. "Mrs. Fawkes," said Rhodri, without turning round, "be so good as to tell this man who I am." There was a pause of perhaps 2 seconds. Then, in a voice as dry and steady as a ledger line, the housekeeper of Dunmow said, "That is His Grace the Duke of Dunmow, sir, and I would advise you to take your hat off." The bowl of peas hit the flagstones. Rhodri did not turn. He would not let himself turn. He heard it. The crack of the china, the rattle and skitter of it across the worn stones, and he stood with his back to the kitchen passage and finished what he had begun, because there were 200 tenants and a frightened man and a money-lender in his yard. And because he had been a coward for 4 years and had promised himself he would not be one for a minute longer, even to look at her, he sent for the magistrate himself. He laid Verrall's receipts on the office table and Coldray's civil, smiling letter beside them, and the bundle of 9 unopened letters beside that. And when old Sir Harry Nantle began to speak of the assizes and the full weight of it, Rhodri put his hand flat on the letters. "He wrote to me 9 times. I did not read one of them. Weigh that in it, Nantle, because I will not have it left out of the account." Verrall wept. It was not a dignified thing, and Rhodri did not look away from it, because he had earned the sight of it. In the end it was done as it was done. Verrall dismissed without character the plate recovered at Rhodri's expense from a Bristol silversmith who suddenly remembered a great deal. Coldray's notes bought up, and Coldray himself sent off the estate with a warning that whitened him nicely, and Josiah Verrall not transported, not hanged, but put on the mail coach to his sister in Shropshire with his son's debts settled, and the door of Dunmow closed behind him forever. Mercy, Sir Harry observed dryly, was an expensive habit. "It is cheaper," said Rhodri, "than what the alternative has already cost this house." The relief fund opened the following Monday. He carried the money out to the cottages himself, in the rain, on foot, and knocked at doors he had never in his life knocked at, and stood on the step with his hat in his hand and let them look at him. And in all that week, Marge Ivy did not speak to him once. He found her at last on the Friday in the still room, because of course it was the still room. She was standing at the bench with her back to him and her hands quite still on the wood, and she did not turn when he came in, and she said before he could speak, "You'll want to knock, Your Grace. It's a servant's room." Rhodri stopped in the doorway. Marged. "Miss Ivy," she said, "if you please." He took that. He stood and took it and felt it go all the way in. "You lied to me," she said. She turned round. Her eyes were dry, which was worse than anything. "For 7 weeks, I fed you. I taught you the boots. I stood up in the plate room in front of Mr. Cobb and swore on your honesty when I could have lost my place for it, and all the time you were—" Her voice cracked once and she stopped it dead. "All the time you were watching us, like something in a book, like a lesson." "Yes," said Rhodri. "Do not agree with me. It is unbearable when you agree with me. It is true, and you've earned true things from me, and it is the only coin I have left." He did not come further into the room. "You are asking whether it was a study, whether I stood among you and made notes. I will tell you exactly what I did. I came here to catch a thief, and I stayed to keep a lie warm, because in that lie you looked at me the way you looked at Tom Ash, and I have known since the boot room that you would never in this world look at the Duke that way. So I said nothing. Every day I said nothing, and I knew what it would cost you, and I let you pay it, because I am a selfish man who has been given everything and has therefore never had to learn to be anything else." The silence went on a long time. "That," said Marge unsteadily, "is a very honest speech." "It is 7 weeks late." "Yes," she said, "it is." She turned back to the bench. She picked up a jar and set it down again without doing anything to it. "Do you know what the worst of it is?" she said. "It isn't the lying. Half the house lies about something. It's that I was proud of you." Her shoulders went, just once, and steadied. "I was proud of the great useless man who couldn't lay a fire and gave his dinner to Tib. I told Sarah in the laundry that Tom Ash will do. He has it in him. And you were a duke the whole time, and none of it cost you anything, and I have been standing here for a week feeling like a fool who admired a coat." "It cost me everything," said Rhodri. "It cost me the only weeks of my life in which anyone has liked me for nothing." She did not answer. "I will not ask you for anything today. I have no right to. But I will say one thing and then I will go, and you may throw me out of the still room, which you have every right to do, and which I would like to see." He drew breath. "Everything Tom Ash was I am. The hands are the same hands. The man who took Ned's turn at the water was not a performance. He did it because you had made him ashamed, and being ashamed in front of you was the first honest feeling I have had since my brother died. You did not admire a coat, Marge. You admired the only part of me that is worth anything, and you are the one who dug it up." He set something on the bench, a small worn book of Horace, the one they had held up in the plate room as evidence. "The rest is yours to decide," he said. "Take a week, take a year. If you wish to leave Dunmow, you will have a character from me that will open any door in England, and £100, and no obligation of any kind, and you need never see me again. That stands whatever you say to me. It is not a bribe. It is what I owe this house, and I am beginning with the person it owes the most." Then he went out and closed the door, and stood in the passage under the bell board with his eyes shut for rather a long time. She did not leave. She did not come to him, either, not that week nor the next. She went on with her work, and he went on with his, which was now the work of a duke who had discovered that his estate had been running on the goodness of a dozen underpaid people while he was in Naples. He raised the wages. He put a proper stove in the servants' hall and a window in the boot room, which caused more comment in the county than the theft had. He kept Ned Pike's sister out of the poorhouse, made Tib under footman, and allowed him, by written order of the Duke, a candle. And once a day, at least once, he found himself at the head of the great staircase, looking down at the green baize door. It was Mrs. Fawkes who said it, dry, iron-haired, keys at her waist, laying the household books before him on a Tuesday morning. "Your Grace will forgive an old woman, but you have made every restitution in this house, except the one you actually want to make, and you are going about it like a man who thinks he can pay for it. She is not a debt. Go and stand in front of her and be a person." Rhodri looked at her. "Was I always this stupid?" "Yes," said Mrs. Fawkes. "But you were never sorry before, so we are making progress." He found her in the orchard, taking in the linen, with the wind coming up and the sheets snapping like sails and her arms full of white. He did not help her. He had learned that much. He stood at the end of the line, in his own coat, with his hat in his hand, and he waited until she had folded the last of it and set the basket down on the grass. "Marge," he said, "I love you." The wind moved in the apple trees. "I have loved you since you told me to keep my thumb under the rim, and I did not know what it was, because nobody had ever spoken to me as though I were an ordinary man who might be improved. You have made me one. That is the whole of my case, and it is not a very good one, and it is all I have. I am not asking you to be grateful, and I am not asking you to be sensible. If you tell me to go, I will go, and I will not come back, and I will still be the better for having known you. But I will not pretend any longer that I can be a fair and useful man in this house, while carefully not saying the one true thing in it." Marge Divey stood in the orchard with her hands red at the knuckles and the wind pulling at her cap, and she looked at him for so long that he thought he might die of it. "They will say you are mad," she said. "They have said it before, and about far worse. They will say I trapped you." "Then they will say it to my face," said Rhodri, "and I shall find that very interesting. I have nothing." Her chin came up. "No family. No portion. 8 years of service, 1 good gown, and a burn on my hand from your kitchen range." "Marge," he said, "I have 30,000 a year, a title I did not earn, an estate I nearly lost through neglect, and no character at all. You are the only person in this county bringing anything to the bargain." And she laughed, whole and low and startled. The one he had heard once in a scullery passage and had been chasing ever since, and pressed the back of her wrist to her mouth, and it did not stop the tears this time. And she said, "Oh, you great useless man," and he crossed the grass in 3 strides and took her hand, the burned one, and turned it over and held it as though it were the plate of Dunmow. He did not kiss her in the orchard. He asked first, which he had never in his life done, about anything. She said yes. He married her in the parish church at Dunmow in the October of that year. In the full light of day, with the doors standing open and the whole household in the pews, Mrs. Fawkes in bombazine, Mrs. Doggett weeping into a cloth, Ned Pike in a new coat, Tib carrying the ring on a cushion with the expression of a man diffusing artillery, and the tenants filling the churchyard, and half the county gentry sitting very upright and saying nothing at all, which is the loudest thing gentry can say. Lady Nantle observed at the wedding breakfast that it was a most unusual match. "It is," said the Duke of Dunmow pleasantly. "My wife once saved me from being turned out of this house without a character. I have never been so afraid of anyone in my life. May I give you some more of the ham? They lived, if it is any business of ours, very well. He never learned to lay a fire." She told him so, most winters, with her feet on the fender in the small library and her hand in his, and he would say that a man must be permitted one incapacity, and she would say that he had been permitted several, and had used them all up before she met him, and the fire would burn down, and the great house would go quiet around them. And every year on the first Monday after Michaelmas, when the relief money went out to the cottages, it was the Duchess of Dunmow who carried, in a good grey wool gown, on foot in whatever weather God sent, because, she said, a person ought to knock on a door with her own hand, and behind her, carrying the box in no livery at all, came a tall man with blacking under one fingernail who had never once, in all the years of it, been able to look away from her.